This video is property of Dr. Peter Hertz of Parkdale High School. Good day, class. We're going to talk about World War II. World history students have been shared a set of slides and notes describing origins and the development of hostilities between 1931 and 1945. You also have had slides and notes about crises between the two world wars and about the rise of totalitarianism. In this one, we discuss how World War II developed. I will refer you to the set of slides shared with you earlier that describe World War II. This will probably go into 2 videos. Thank you. We can date World War II from 1931 to 1945. 1931 was the Japanese seizure of Manchuria from China. China declared war on Japan in 1937. And so the Second Sino-Japanese War starts then. It flows into a wider conflict, which involves a war in Europe as well, and the United States war against Japan in the Pacific as well. When did World War II begin? This is a question. We have the Japanese militarists seeking to dominate in the rest of Asia. We have Joseph Stalin wanting all the territories of the former Russian Empire incorporated into his Soviet Union, and his support of communist revolutions elsewhere, including the organization of communist movements in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. We also have Benito Mussolini wanting a larger Italian empire and sphere of influence in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. We have Adolf Hitler wanting Lebensraum, repeat, Lebensraum, or living space for Germany. He wanted the destruction of the Jews and an end to communism. And so we have 4 big ideas that are moving together to create a worldwide disaster, World War II. Okay, in your slide number 3, you have Hitler's ambitions in Europe. First of all, you would see that Poland, Bohemia, Moravia, the Netherlands, Austria, Luxembourg, and parts of France, as well as maybe other pieces of territory elsewhere, incorporated into a greater German Reich or empire. In addition, in former Soviet territory, Hitler planned to establish Reichskommissariats, which would be areas that Germany would exploit and possibly colonize at later times. Now, on the map given on slide 3 of World War II, you see a lavender line stretching from the Baltic Sea down to the Caucasus Mountains. That represents the actual furthest extent that German armies penetrated Soviet territory in World War II. Needless to say, this greater German Reich was not realized. On slide 4, you have Mussolini's plan for a new Roman Empire. In the 1920s, Mussolini hoped to expand Italy by taking Albania, Corsica, parts of southeastern France, and portions of Yugoslavia and Switzerland. He wanted to make Spain and all of southeastern Europe an Italian sphere of influence. He also hoped to expand Italian holdings in Africa. Okay, after 1918, Russia lost territory. The two maps on slide number 5 show you Europe before World War I and Europe afterwards. We note that Finland, Estonia, and Latvia and Lithuania became independent of Russia. We saw that Bessarabia was lost to Russia and given to Romania. We see an independent Poland, which included not only former Russian territory, but also former Austrian and German territory as well. Another thing that entered into the thinking of Joseph Stalin was that many Latvians and Finns had supported the communist revolution, and Stalin believed that these needed to be incorporated into the Soviet Union as well. Now, we cannot think that the Soviet Union only lost territory and influence, although it lost European holdings as a result of World War I. In Asia, it actually expanded. In slide number 6, we see a meeting of Vladimir Lenin and Damdin Sukhbator. Damdin Sukhbator was a Mongolian communist, and he came to power in the 1920s because of Soviet help. In 1911, when China had a revolution, Outer Mongolia declared independence from China and was first ruled by the Bogd Khan. Now, China under Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai refused to recognize Mongol independence, claiming that the Republic of China was the successor to the Qing Empire. Well, what happened was, in 1916 to 18, there was a Chinese invasion of Mongolia. In 1917, anti-communist Russians under Baron von Ungern-Sternberg invaded Mongolia to establish a base to escape the communists. They drove out the Chinese, and then the Soviet Communist Army invaded Mongolia and put Damdin Sukhbator into power over what was called the Mongolian People's Republic. The northwestern part of Outer Mongolia became a separate communist state called the People's Republic of Tannu Tuva. This area was annexed to the Soviet Union in 1944. Okay, we move on to the Nazi ideology. Nazi is short for Nationalsozialist, which means National Socialist in German. Now, Hitler believed very much in the purity of the German race, that it should be protected by all possible means, especially by ridding Germany of such elements as Jews, gypsies, and illegitimate part black children left behind by French occupying forces. Now, much as Hitler's ideas are hated today, and rightly so, they do have a long, honorable history, and they represent, unhappily, some of the best science of the 19th century. Okay, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a movement called eugenics. Eugenics means good birth. Sounds harmless, does it? Well, what it means, it was a meeting of the new science of evolution, the new areas of studies of sociology, and further advances in biology. And what this assumed was that human beings, no less than cattle or sheep or horses or dogs, could be bred to be better. And it also had a corollary that some races of man were more advanced and more evolved than others. In the United States, for instance, not long after Charles Darwin's Origins of Species was published, better scientific minds in the United States, including some of the most respected ones, used this theory of evolution to bolster a doctrine of white supremacy. It rationalized both the enslavement of the African American and, after the Civil War, it rationalized keeping the African American in an inferior position in society. Now, this idea was very influential with Adolf Hitler. He believed that the people of European race, whom he called Aryans, were superior and more highly evolved. He called them the Herrenvolk, or the master race, that was destined to rule all others. And of the Aryan races, the Germans were the highest. But naturally, that was how Hitler thought. And after Hitler took power in 1933, his government fostered a lot of propaganda against the Jews. Especially popular were cartoons that would contrast the supposedly noble Aryan with the supposedly inferior peoples, such as Jews, Sub-Saharan Africans, and Slavs. And note how the cartoon offered you in slide number 8 makes the black man and the Jews look subhuman. But this was how propaganda was used in Hitler's Germany after he took power in 1933. Well, these wars of ideologies, of extreme nationalism that we find in Italian fascism and German National Socialism on the one side, and extreme socialism as you found in Soviet communism in the other, they had a showdown in 1936 to 1939 in Spain. They say that the Spanish Civil War was a rehearsal for World War II. The Spaniards had formed a republic. It was quite unstable, dominated by different groups of liberals, socialists, Stalinist communists, Trotskyist communists, and anarchists. Against this, a general by the name of Francisco Franco led portions of the Spanish army in revolt. This launched a civil war, and what you see in the map given on page 9, unfortunately this map is in French, but you can get the idea. It divided Spain, and by March of 1939, the nationalists had expanded from their original bases in the far south and in the north of Spain to occupy the entire country. Well, the European War began in 1939. And how? If you look at the map given on slide number 10, you see the area of Germany in gray. Notice that by 1939, Germany had incorporated Austria, an area of western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland that was inhabited by ethnic Germans. You see also that it had absorbed the rest of Bohemia, Moravia, which is the western half of Czechoslovakia. You see a light gray, the independent state of Slovakia that was created, that was an ally of Germany. You see that Hungary has gotten a little bit of Czechoslovak territory as well. Well, what happened? Britain and France got nervous. They formed an alliance. Hitler was very aggressive towards Poland, so Britain and France made an agreement with Poland, which was countered by Hitler making an agreement with Joseph Stalin. Now, this was interesting. While rising to power in Germany between the 1920s and the 1930s, Hitler declared himself a fierce enemy of communism and wanted to uproot it and destroy it. And in many ways he did in Germany itself. And most German communists who survived the purges in Germany fled to the Soviet Union. Well, all of a sudden, Hitler turns around and he makes an agreement with Stalin to divide up Eastern Europe, especially Poland. Well, the map shows Poland in two shades of orange and pink. The orange part got occupied by Germany, the pink part by the Soviet Russia. And at that point, as Hitler attacked Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany. Further, the Soviet Union was told that it could do what it liked with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Finland. Well, so Stalin moved into those countries. However, Finland resisted in 1939. Although Finland was greatly worn down, Finland was defeated by the overwhelming superiority of Soviet numbers, and had to give up some territory to the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the Finns inflicted so much damage on the Soviet state, on the Soviet forces, that the Soviet Union decided it would be unwise to take over Finland. And the two countries made a short peace. Well, what next? Hitler, determined to conquer Europe, turns against Britain and France and launches what is called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. One of the things that German armies had learned between the 1860s, when Prussia was uniting Germany, and World War I, that speed and mobility were very important in fighting a war. And so what they would do, they used advanced tanks and airplanes that they had been developing. And in April of 1940, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway. In May of 1940, they occupied the Netherlands, most of Belgium, and all of Luxembourg, and they cut across France. On June of 1940, France collapsed. And the British forces that had been sent to help the French were trapped in a little area near the French-Belgian border and the sea. This area is called Dunkirk. However, the British leader, Winston Churchill, who came to power in 1939 after the government of Neville Chamberlain was voted out of power. Well, Churchill organized every boat he could find, including ordinary people's sailboats and fishing boats, to go to that corner of France and pick up as many British soldiers and French soldiers that they could. And that Dunkirk evacuation was a very famous episode of World War II. It probably saved Britain. Well, the Blitzkrieg continued. Between October of 1940 and April 1941, Mussolini in Italy decides his forces are going to show that they're just as good as the Germans, and they invade Greece and they get defeated. There's a famous saying that when Mussolini's ambassador asked the Greek leader, Ioannis Metaxas, to surrender, Metaxas answered with one word, "Ochi," which means no. The war began and the Italian troops were defeated by the Greeks. So Hitler, who had an alliance with Mussolini, came to Mussolini's rescue by invading Yugoslavia and Greece in April of 1941. And so by June of 1941, basically Hitler runs Europe. The map shows you that France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were occupied. Half of Poland was German ruled. Denmark and Norway were occupied. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were German allies. And as well, the southern half of France was made into a satellite state ruled from the city of Vichy. So we speak about the Vichy French regime. And because of taking France, well, possibly Hitler had a chance of having Syria and Lebanon in the Middle East and much of Africa. Well, Western resistance to Hitler, what happens? In slide number 13, you have Sir Winston Churchill, who lived 1874 to 1965. He became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in 1939. He believed it would be impossible to deal with Hitler and Britain should prepare for all-out war. He said the Germans are either at your throat or at your feet. Another important leader, you see General Charles de Gaulle, who lived 1890 to 1970. He was a French general who refused to surrender to the Germans. He and a portion of the French army fled to Britain, and he called on French colonies to join him in fighting the Germans. However, most of the French Empire agreed to follow the German satellite regime at Vichy after the French surrender. One colonial governor did not. This was Félix Éboué, who lived 1884 to 1944. He was a native of French Guiana in South America and was made the governor of French Equatorial Africa, which today is the states of Chad, Centrafrique, Congo at Brazzaville, and Gabon. Éboué decided to follow de Gaulle's Free French forces and thus kept the Germans and Italians out of an important part of Africa. So he's a person to remember. Other people who resisted. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands fled from the Germans and led a Dutch government in exile that was headquartered in Britain. Dutch forces fought the Japanese in the East Asia, although they were defeated there. And another one who resisted was King Haakon VII of Norway. When the Germans invaded and beat the Norwegian forces, King Haakon and his government fled to Britain. King Haakon ordered the Norwegian Merchant Marine, which was the ships that were owned by Norway that traded, to sail to either neutral or allied ports. And thus Germany was denied the use of Norway's considerable civilian fleet, which was very, very useful to the Allies later on, when there was a lot of shipping between Canada and Britain, and later between the US and Britain to help Britain's war effort. Further, the Belgian government in exile kept the Belgian Congo on the Allied side. And Congolese soldiers were used by the British in parts of Africa and Asia. Ultimately, they helped defeat the Italians in Ethiopia. Since you will remember, before the general war broke out in Europe, Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia and driven its king, Haile Selassie, into exile. Well, China was embattled. The Second Sino-Japanese War lasted from 1937 to 1945. Although China had been resisting Japan since 1931, while at the same time fighting a civil war between the nationalist government of Jiang Jieshi and the communist movement under Mao Zedong. In 1937, General Zhang Xueliang, who had been driven from Manchuria by the Japanese, kidnapped President Jiang and forced him to form a united front against Japan. So the communists and the nationalists briefly stopped their civil war. In December of 1937, Japanese forces occupied Nanjing, the capital of China. The Chinese government fled first to Wuhan, which is, or then called Hankou, which, as you now know, the COVID, China's supreme leader, refused to surrender, and Chinese resistance ultimately tied down well over 900,000 Japanese soldiers in China, which meant that later, when the U.S. had to fight in the Pacific, those soldiers of Japan were busy elsewhere. Now, in 1936, Japan had joined Nazi Germany in what was called the Anti-Comintern Pact. While aimed against the Soviet Union, its chief result was to end German military training of Jiang Jieshi's Chinese army. Now, while often defeated by Japanese forces, the Chinese still scored some important victories at Taiyuan in Shandong in the spring of 1938, and at Changsha in Hunan during the winter of 1941-42. These showed China's will to resist, and the latter victory, fought after the entry into World War II, convinced the Roosevelt administration in the U.S. that China's position in World War II was mostly defensive and filled with losses. But among other things, the alliance with the U.S. and Britain led to the end of the unequal treaties with China that had been made after the Opium Wars. For those treaties were ended in 1943, and China accepted as an equal partner. Now, the picture you see in number 18, that's a picture of the Chinese forces fighting at Taiyuan in one of their few victories against the Japanese. Well, we may have to stop here for the time being because I've gone over 40 minutes. We will talk about the rest of World War II in a following video.